With conference season behind us, the chief executive of the Centre for Cities surveys the political landscape around devolution policy. First up, Labour. This year's Labour Party conference will be largely remembered primarily for the leadership's successful bid to empower its membership, through the successful McDonnell Amendment, which means future leadership contestants can be nominated with the support of just 10% of party MPs, and through the decision to give members a bigger platform in the conference itself. It is ironic, however, that in these efforts to give a greater voice to grassroots members and people outside the Westminster bubble, the party has sidelined its two most visible and important representatives outside London, Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham, the Metro Mayors of Greater Manchester and Liverpool City region respectively. Indeed, Sadiq Khan, who as Mayor of London is the most powerful Labour politician in England and has the biggest personal mandate in British politics, was only granted an opportunity to address the conference last minute, having campaigned for a slot for weeks. This seems particularly odd given the rhetoric from the Labour leadership and shadow cabinet this conference season about its plans for devolution. For example, Jeremy Corbyn used a fringe event to reiterate his vision of spreading municipal socialism across Britain, and vowed to end what he described as the government's piecemeal devolution by empowering local government. This echoed comments by Andrew Gwynn, the Shadow Communities Secretary, who promised that in power Labour would oversee a local government renaissance, rolling back austerity and devolving more powers to places than the current government. In truth, however, this year's conference, and the decision to snub the mayors in particular, highlighted the ambivalence of the Labour leadership when it comes to devolution, and the growing sense of a divide between the National Party and local leadership. For a start, beyond the rhetoric about going further than the Conservatives in handing down powers from the top, there was nothing at this year's conference to suggest that the party has an ambitious plan or well-developed policies on how it would do that. Indeed, at the Centre for Cities fringe event on the future of urban leadership, Steve Rotherham admitted that the party's policy on devolution is unclear, while Andy Burnham described it as half-hearted. Moreover, all the key policies set out by Labour in this conference season, and in its general election manifesto earlier this year, reflect a top-down, centralised approach to policy-making, from the proposal to abolish PFI contrasts, to plans to nationalise the railways and introduce national education and care services. Rather than offering a vision of empowering a local government renaissance, these policies suggest that a Corbyn government would primarily view local government as a platform to deliver its big national policy priorities. This would be a mistake. While the national leadership has been emboldened by its showing in the last general election, it nonetheless has significant ground to make up if it is to have a chance of taking power at the national level. Indeed, while in the last election Labour consolidated its support in big cities across the North and Midlands, it also lost ground in some of its traditional strongholds, conceding the Stoke South seat to the Conservatives having held it for 80 years, and also losing former safe seats of Mansfield and Middlesbrough South. As such, Labour cannot afford to be complacent about its support across the North and Midlands. One obvious way to shore up that support, and to win back votes in these places, is to shout loudly about what the party can do for people and places when it has power, which is why Labour should be making the most of its mayors and local government leaders. Indeed, in cities across the UK and towns, counties and districts, Labour is already in government. Collectively, Labour mayors and councillors represent around 31 million people across England and Wales. The Metro Mayors are the most visible manifestation of this, and less than 5 months into office are already having a big impact on the national and local political stage. This has been most evident in the campaign for more investment in northern transport links spearheaded by Burnham and Rotherham in recent months. Without the intervention of the mayors, it's hard to imagine this issue, which seems unlikely to fade anytime soon, having gained such national prominence. Furthermore, if Jeremy Corbyn's leadership has in part been characterised by his promise of offering a new way of doing politics, this is exactly what the Metro Mayors offer, bringing decision-making away from Whitehall and much closer to the communities they represent. Similarly, if the vote for Brexit was characterised by the desire to take back control from Brussels, the mayors are enabling people in places like Greater Manchester to take back control over issues such as housing, transport and education. The Labour leadership should support this by countering the traditional Whitehall knows best attitude which dominates British politics, and which represents a formidable obstacle to the mayors having an impact in their city regions. However, replacing one centralising government with another, even if it was a Labour government, would do nothing to readdress this problem. In the coming years, we can expect the profile of the mayoralties to grow, and the impact they are having in their city regions to become more visible. Labour's national leadership is missing a trick by failing to get squarely behind them. Andrew Carter is chief executive of the think tank Centre for Cities, on whose blog this article previously appeared. At Labour conference last month, Jeremy Corbyn made one big announcement on the party's plans for tackling the housing crisis in our cities: rent controls. However, while Labour argue that this would help to make living in high-demand cities like London and Oxford more affordable, these plans actually run the risk of deepening the housing crisis rather than solving it. We don't know yet exactly what form of rent controls Corbyn has in mind, but we can reasonably assume they will go further than Ed Miliband's proposals in 2014, which capped rent increases to inflation within 3-year tenancies but left them uncapped between renewals. In stating that rent controls exist in many cities across the world and I want our cities to have those powers too, Corbyn may be seeking to emulate the recent reform in Berlin, through which all landlords are barred from increasing rents by more than 10% of the local average. But despite the stated aim of supporting people with lower incomes to live in high-demand, expensive cities, this policy may actually have the opposite effect. The root of the housing crisis in British cities is that we are not building enough homes, particularly in the most successful cities, and rent control could make this problem worse. Paradoxically, it would push some of the costs of housing up. That's because rent control would shut off the pipeline of private investment in rented housing. Some 55,000 homes in London have been or are in the process of being built through build-to-rent schemes, as well as hundreds in cities like Bristol, Reading, and Slough. These new homes would not exist with rent control, as it would make these investments unprofitable. As a result, not only would the potential residents of such housing lose out from this construction disappearing, so would the rest of the city, as those residents are then forced to live or move into the existing housing stock, therefore crowding out and displacing other city dwellers. The location of build-to-rent schemes hints at which cities would feel the impact of rent control the most. The UK's high productivity, high housing demand cities such as Oxford, London, York, Brighton and Reading all have average house prices more than 9 times the average income, and so also experience very high rents. Cities with weaker economies such as Blackburn and Hull may not feel the effects of rent control as sharply, but only because they have less demand for housing overall. Undoubtedly, rent control will make some rented housing in these expensive cities cheaper, but with the unintended consequence of introducing new costs, financial and social, into the housing market. For example, for decades New York City has prioritized rent control over house building, with the result that it has failed to keep up with demand for new homes. As such, rent-controlled luxury apartments in elite neighborhoods in Manhattan have been rented out for decades at less than £100 a month, but average-only apartments without rent control in working-class parts of Brooklyn cost upwards of £1,300 a month. Rent control in Stockholm sees locals wait decades for new rent-controlled flats. And Berlin's experience of rent control has not achieved their stated goal of stopping gentrification and has caused some rents to spike as landlords respond to the new incentives. All the international evidence shows that rent controls divide renters into the privileged and the outsiders. Those already in rented flats when controls are introduced are well, but the city's young people and migrants from the rest of the country and abroad are penalized as they need the new homes that are not being built. The shortage of housing then makes it harder for cities to attract the workers and firms they need to be successful. Expensive cities like Cambridge have to manage the costs of growth by building more housing and using the new tax revenues to fund more infrastructure in the key locations that have lots of jobs and opportunities. Rent controls will make this more difficult and worsen the inequality of growth within successful cities. Labour is also promising a big expansion of social housing, and it could be argued that this would balance out any negative effects of introducing rent control on the private house building industry. This is unlikely. London needs roughly 50,000 homes a year, and is currently building 20,000, mostly privately. Even at the peak of municipal social housing in the 1960s, London boroughs were not building more than 30,000 a year. The expansion of the social housing program would have to surpass the historic peak London reached, and would put huge construction and maintenance burdens onto local government at a time when capacity within the sector is at its lowest point for more than a decade, just to keep prices stable. As such, Labour's plans are not viable. Ultimately, Labour's enthusiasm for rent controls is misplaced, and its focus on replacing private rented housing with social housing should be a lower priority than simply building more homes. If Labour wants to make housing more affordable for the many, not just the few, Corbyn should promise to commit to green belt reform that could unlock 1.4 meters homes within 25 minutes walk of existing train stations around our 10 least affordable cities, all on just 5% of the total green belt. Fixing our broken planning system should be the priority for cities that want to help renters, not introducing new problems. Anthony Breach is an economic analyst at the Centre for Cities, on whose blog this post first appeared.